Pray together. Jesus, we know that in the gospel so many times when someone was blind, you walked up to them and you touched their eyes so that they could see. And we remember this morning, Father, that wasn't just a physical thing. That was a sign for us, for everyone else who was watching, that you can do that for us inside, not just outside, that you can touch our eyes so that we can see. So, Jesus, I pray that you would do that for every one of us in this room this morning. Touch our eyes so that we can see the truth that you are going to show us today and change us by it. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, following last week, I had some great conversations with many of you out in the foyer and in the gym there, and I just had a chance to hear a whole bunch of stories about your lives, not just stories about mine, and it makes me feel just a little bit better that I wasn't the only one who found themselves in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. Now, you may not be willing to admit to it here, but many of us, we've seen the good, we've seen the bad, and we've seen the ugly of friendships. And I got asked a bunch of questions last week that I wanted to maybe respond to before we dive into our message for today. The first one, the most common question that you asked, probably every second person, it was a deep theological question, and this is what you wanted to know. What happened to your keys? How many of you are wondering that after last week? You just say, I left you hanging just a little bit. I told you all about my life. I told you all about my adventures as an outlaw. I told you what happened to me, but I didn't tell you what happened to the keys that got me in all of that trouble. And here's the answer to that question. When my dad finally came to pick me up, and he glowered at me the whole time, when he unlocked the truck, we looked inside, and they had fallen underneath the back seat of the truck and moved all the way to the back. Somehow, in some sort of magical chain of events, they had fallen out of my pocket, bounced off the console, and slid all the way to the back of the truck so that no one could see them. And I sat there after he picked me up, and I realized that all of the pain, all of the rides in the police cruiser, all of the mug shots, all of the interrogations, everything was for nothing. Absolutely nothing. It hurts, doesn't it? Do you feel my pain just a little bit? All of that could have been absolutely for nothing if I would have just called my dad. So the lesson from this story is call your dad if you're in trouble. If you ever get in a situation, you might as well call first. The police will catch you the other way. That's what you can take away from this. I don't believe that anything is by accident. I think God wanted to teach me a lesson, and I think you needed a story last Sunday. So that's why he put me through what he put me through. The second thing, it was actually more of a serious question that some of you had asked me, and I thought it was a really good one. I'm really proud of the way that you have been processing this, because I don't think we talk about friendships enough in the church. And one of the questions I got was this: how do we balance reaching out while still at the same time walking with the wise? How many of you wondered that last week? I mean, Solomon calls us to this, and it was really clear, just crystal clear, that God calls us to walk with the wise, and you will become wise. But if you hang out with the wrong people, you're going to hurt the way that they hurt. But how do we balance that with the character of Jesus and the things that he calls us to in the New Testament? How do we reach out while at the same time walk with the wise? And I thought and I chewed on that question during the week. And the answer that I came to is this: I think that Jesus is the best example for us on this. And if you're ever wondering what the answer to any question is, just say Jesus, and you got a 50-50 chance of being right. But Jesus himself, if you watch the way that he interacted with people, if you watch the way that he lived his life, he had his 12 disciples, he had his inner circle, he had his people, and even within the 12 disciples, he had 3 more that he was especially close with. But he also had crowds of people that would follow him all around, crowds of people that he would minister to, that he would heal, and that he would teach. And I think what we realize from Jesus' life is this: is there are different types of friendships. Amen? There are different types of friendships and different types of relationships. And I think what Solomon was cautioning us to and against is be careful about who you let into your inner circle. I think he would say the same thing that Jesus would say: go after the one and leave the 99. Reach out to the people that are in your life. Tell them the story of Jesus and the way that it has affected you, and mentor the people that are willing to be mentored. You should be pouring into those around you who are willing to take it in. But I think he would also say this: be very intentional and careful about who you let into your inner circle, about who you let that close to you. So I want you to think about that this week. I think it's an excellent idea for us to chew on, about the example of Jesus, about how to balance those things, how to reach out while walking with the wise at the same time. So to start off this morning, I found some incontrovertible proof that who you hang out with changes who you are. If you weren't convinced last week, I have something that I think will absolutely convince you this week. I have physical proof that if you hang out with people, eventually you will become like them, and this is what I found. Enough said, right? Enough said. See, if you hang out long enough with someone, apparently this doesn't even matter what species you are a part of. It actually transfers over. Have you ever had that before? You walked up to someone and you saw their dog and you thought, no way. There's no way that you two look that similar. It's impossible. Sometimes even your facial expressions will start to transfer over. Any football fans? And my personal favorite. Oh no, this one's really good. My personal favorite is Fabio's dog next. Deep spiritual start to our service this morning. We talked last week about how if you hang out long enough with certain people, your brain waves actually start to align. You actually start to think like the people that you spend time with, and this is like a revelation, and it was for me, and I hope it is for you, that this isn't just a spiritual thing. This is something that God had foreknown long before we could prove it, but you actually become like the people that you hang out with. And so we're in a series right now called Connected, and we're in a series that is all about what does God have to say about the friendships that you and I forge and that we keep together? What does God have to say about the people that we hang around with? And if you have been with us the whole series, if you have been tracking with me so far, maybe you've understood that really God has designed us for this. That friendships aren't just an addition to our lives, and relationships aren't just something that we get to when we have time, but these are the fundamental things that God has hardwired us for. And friendship these days, truth be told, is in trouble. People don't have enough friends, and they don't have close enough friends of the ones that they do. And if you were with us here last week, you realize, maybe you're tracking with me, and you realize that the people that you hang out with really do shape your destiny. That the people that you choose to do life with really do affect the trajectory of your life, whether for good or for ill. And if you've been with me so far, I want to shift gears this morning, and I want to start to ask a different question. If you've been tracking and following along and you're with me so far, I want to start to ask this question this morning, and this is what it is. What is it that makes a good friend? What is it that makes a good friendship? Like, we all have acquaintances. You all have people that you come to church with and you sit beside. There are people that if you saw in the mall that you would talk to and you'd strike up a conversation. But what is it that takes those kinds of relationships and turns them into real, true, lifelong, meaningful friendships? What kind of characteristics should we be looking for that we should be building our lives together with? And I started to think about that question. What is it that makes a friendship real? And what is it that transforms a friendship from an acquaintance into a real, meaningful friendship? I was immediately drawn to the story of David and Jonathan. How many of you know the story of David and Jonathan? I think most of you have heard of King David, but the story of David and Jonathan is a huge part of David's life. And David wouldn't be who he is today if it wasn't for Jonathan. David wouldn't have made it to where he made it, and he wouldn't be in the history books as we see it in the Bible as we have it now if it wasn't for Jonathan. In fact, if it wasn't for Jonathan, David may never have actually become king outside of God's direct and divine intervention. And as we're going to learn this morning, the friendship between David and Jonathan is one of the most unlikely friendships in the entire Bible. It's the most unlikely friendship once you realize the circumstances that they were living in and the forces that were working and pushing on them at the time. And yet it becomes one of the most powerful friendships in the entire Bible. And it is the story of two friends who had everything stacked against them. It is a story of two friends who had every force in the world pushing on them, and yet they managed to forge, and forge is an incredibly accurate word because forge has to do with pressure and it has to do with temperature. In the midst of all the drama, in the midst of all the distraction and the disaster, they forged an incredible friendship, and I believe that God wants to teach us this morning how to do the same thing in our lives if we can learn from their story. What kind of characteristics should we be looking for, and what kind of people should we be if we want to build meaningful friendships? And before we get started, what I want to make sure you realize is what I am not saying. I'm not saying that you should have a checklist, and when you meet a new friend, you should stand there with a clipboard and go, yes, yes, no, yes, no. I'm not suggesting that you do friendship interviews before you hang out with somebody. In fact, that is a guaranteed way for you never to have any friends. If you have a form to fill out and a 7 to 10 processing days worth of response time, this is a way to a lonely, lonely life. But I will tell you this, that friendships, good friendships have certain characteristics in common. They have certain things that are transferable, and if you watch good friendships in your life and in other people's lives, you will see these same characteristics. And the reason why is that friendships are made. They don't accidentally happen. Do you understand that? Friendships are made. They don't accidentally happen. They are built, and they are built on a foundation of certain characteristics and commitments. And if we can get that right, then everything else will flow from that. If we as a church can get that right, you will expound the number of relationships that you have here and the quality of those relationships. These are the things that good friends do that we are going to dig into this morning. And these are the things that you should do if you want to be a good friend. Let's start with the story. 1 Samuel chapter 18, verses 1 through 8. After David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David, along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. Whatever mission Saul sent him on, David was so successful that Saul gave him a high rank in the army, and this pleased all the troops and Saul's officers as well. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. As they danced, they sang this: Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. Saul was very angry. This refrain displeased him greatly. They have credited David with tens of thousands, he thought, but me with only thousands. What more can he get but the kingdom? Let's stop there. Maybe you know the story of David and maybe you don't, but the backstory before this passage is this. David, he was a poor shepherd boy. He was the youngest, he was the runt of the litter in a bunch of strapping and strong brothers. But one day Samuel showed up, the prophet of God, one of the last in the land, and he anointed David and nobody else to be king over Israel. And this little runt, this little shepherd boy, this little guy off in the field who wasn't even there when Samuel came, he was going to be the next king of Israel. The only problem was Israel already had a king, didn't they? Israel already had a king, and he was tall, and he was strong, and he was dangerous, and his name was Saul. And guess who Saul's son was? It's Jonathan. So already in the story, you see some of the tensions that are at play between this friendship. And when I said there were things stacked against them, you're going to be blown away at how many odds they had to overcome in order to make this friendship work, which should really tip you off to the fact that what they were doing and how they were doing was profoundly effective in forging a real and meaningful friendship. You see, Jonathan was King Saul's son. Jonathan was second in command in all of the army. Jonathan was rightful heir to the throne. And when Saul was to die, Jonathan would then become king. The only problem is only one of these two guys can become king. David's been anointed, but it's going to be a long time until he comes. But Jonathan is the next one in line and the heir to the throne, and this begins the most difficult part of their friendship. Now, if you read verse 1, it talks about how instantly David and Jonathan struck up a friendship together. And I don't know if you've ever had this happen before, but have you ever met somebody that you had never met before? Have you ever met them and as soon as you started talking, you realized that it's almost like you've known this person forever, but you just met? Have you ever met someone and all of a sudden you felt like this is just a kindred spirit? This is someone that you connect with. You don't have to try hard. You just automatically, you almost finish each other's sentences. There's somebody who is in line with you. It was like an instant connection when you read the story because there wasn't a lot of backlog here. There wasn't a lot of things that happened. David and Jonathan, they met together after David had just felled the giant. David had just killed Goliath. And now when they talk together, they strike up this almost instantaneous friendship. But I want you to realize something about this story is that it seems like it's more than that in Scripture. And I want to explain to you what I mean by that. Because I believe in life there are good friendships. I believe there are great friendships. And every once in a while there is a God-ordained friendship that God has placed somebody in your path. Have you ever had that before? There are good friends that you will have, maybe friends from high school. There are great friends that you have that may span different ages and stages of your life. But every once in a while, God will bring somebody incredibly special into your life, a God-ordained friendship that He is going to use in a special way to grow you and to challenge you and to take you to the next level. Have any of you ever had one of those friendships before? They may not be at the same age as you. They may not be at the same stage of life as you, but they are there because God has brought them to you, and He has a special plan for you and for them in your life. And when I look at the story of David and Jonathan, I can't interpret this any other way because there was this instant binding of them together in a way that's different than most friends who come. Now, I had this happen to me my very first year in ministry. My very first year in ministry started about 25 minutes that way in Chatham. And I was at a church, and I remember they had a 5-day interview that they flew me down for. How many of you have ever been through a 5-day interview? So I win. 5 days, morning and afternoon and evening, I met with different people in the church, and guess where I stayed at night? While we were here interviewing for the job, I stayed at the senior pastor's house at night. So we were under 24-hour surveillance the entire 5 days that we were here. And as stressful as that was and as intense as that was, I will tell you right now that staying at the senior pastor's house was the best possible thing I could have done, because right from the beginning, he was in my corner and he was giving me hints about how to answer questions. I don't know if that's allowed or not. Don't worry, I didn't do that with Nichelle, but he was kind of preparing me for how to angle myself in these different situations, and he would debrief with me afterwards, because from the very beginning, he wanted me in that role. He was a fun guy. He was a wise guy. His name was Keith, not a wise guy, a wise man. Well, maybe a wise guy too. Keith Gagne. And I remember after I had come the second time for the second set of 5-day interviews, and I had preached just like Nichelle did here before the whole congregation, and I had to leave the room so that they could vote, because you can't vote and look at the poor person struggling there at the front. So I had to leave, and he took me to Swiss Chalet for lunch. I'd never been to Swiss Chalet for lunch. And I remember this as if it was yesterday. As we were walking to the door, he opened the door for me, and he looked me in the eye, and he said this to me. He says, "I feel the Lord binding us together right now already." I feel the Lord binding us together right here and right now already. Now, I thought that was kind of interesting because I hadn't got the job yet. See, nobody had voted or affirmed me into that position, but he felt so strongly in that moment that God was binding us together, and there was almost 40 years between us. But this was a friendship that God was going to forge and that He was going to use in many ways over that next 2 years as I began in ministry. He was the one that I went to when I didn't know where to go, and when things got difficult, He's the one who helped me through other than the Lord. So it was this binding together. Now, I nearly lost that bind about 20 minutes into this lunch, because when I got to Swiss Chalet, I ordered a hamburger. See, I didn't know at Swiss Chalet you're not supposed to order hamburgers. It was the only beef item on the whole menu, but I didn't know that chicken was the big thing there. We don't have those out west. And after I ordered a hamburger, he just looked at me for a second and he wondered if he had made a mistake. He just wasn't sure that he should have said what he said. By the way, what do you say when somebody says that to you? When somebody says, "I feel like the Lord is binding us together," what do you say? Thank you? Give him a thumbs up? Like, what's the correct response in a situation like that? But I want to tell you that there was something special about that friendship. We weren't in the same age or stage of life, but there was something special about that friendship that God used in a remarkable way. And there are times that God will bind you together with somebody for a period and a purpose. And this is what He did with David and Jonathan, because neither one of them were going to be the same without each other. Now, when I read the story of how they became friends, there are some parts of it that continue to blow me away, because this gets compressed into just a couple of verses. But as David and Jonathan are talking, David must have at some point told Jonathan that he was anointed next to be king. The rest of the story doesn't make sense otherwise. David must have shared at some point that after he had killed Goliath, after he walked out there with 5 smooth stones and no armor and no helmet and felled the giant, something must have struck up in their conversation where David shared the fact that Samuel had come and anointed him. And in the process of this, Jonathan, it says, made a covenant with David. Covenant is that word that we use when you get married. You make a promise to be together. But in the Old Testament, they used that word a whole lot more. It was this promise that they were going to be friends for life. But if you read the story of David and Jonathan, it's actually something even more than that. And this is the thing that blows me away. Because Jonathan, after he makes this covenant with David, he doesn't just stop there. He actually takes off his robe. He takes off his belt. He takes off his sword. And he hands it over to David. Now, you and I don't do stuff like that, mostly because we don't have those things. But he took off all of these things that were royal symbols of who he was, royal symbols of what his future was going to be, and he handed them to David. And do you know what he was saying by this in this moment? He repeats it over and over again throughout the story. Do you know what Jonathan was saying? This is what he was saying. David, one day you will be king, and one day I will serve you. Isn't that amazing? One day you will be king, and one day I will serve you. And I want you just to stop there for a minute. I want you to realize just how big of a moment this was, not just in their friendship, but in the Bible. Because Jonathan was willing to give up his future. He was willing to give up being king. He was willing to give up the throne and all of the fame and all of the glory that came along with it. He was willing to give all of this up for his friend David if it was the Lord's will that he would be king instead. How would you respond if you were in a situation where you were lined up for the biggest promotion of your entire life and your friend wanted it and you handed it over to him? Now, there's more going on there than that, but I just want you to realize how incredible of a moment this was, because in most friendships, the truth is we're barely willing to give up anything for our friends. I know friendships where they're not willing to give up the remote control for each other. I know friendships where they won't even give up enough control about choosing what you watch on TV, as if people used remote controls and watch TV anymore. Anyways, but they wouldn't even give up the simplest things. And here is Jonathan willing to give up his entire future for his friend David, if it is the will of God. And you just need to realize how incredible a sacrifice this was. So in only 3 verses into their friendship, this is one of the most amazing friendships that I have ever seen. I've never seen anything like this in my life. Now, if the throne wasn't enough to put stress on their relationship, they also had drama. Any of you have drama in your lives? Well, they had capital D drama. They had family drama that will make your house look like the Waltons, if you know who the Waltons are. Every once in a while, my mom says my family is like the Waltons, and she says that's a compliment, but I feel like it's an insult. It feels like she's saying we're boring. Did any of you watch the Waltons? Does anybody even know what I'm talking about? All right, all 4 of us. Why don't you put verses 6, 7, and 8 back up there, Gary, for a second. I want to read this again. Verses 6, 7, and 8. When the men were returning home after David had killed the Philistine, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul with singing and dancing, with joyful songs and with timbrels and lyres. We'll have a timbrel next week on the stage. As they danced, they sang this, and this is, pay attention to this. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Just leave that up there for a moment. Saul takes issue with this song and this line that people are singing, and I want you to realize that when you are paranoid, you hear things that people aren't saying. Did you know that? When you are paranoid, you hear things that other people actually aren't saying. Not only do you think that everyone else is out to get you, this is kind of the definition of paranoia, but when you are paranoid, you hear things that other people actually aren't saying. And you have to understand Hebrew poetry to understand why this is true, but the women weren't actually praising David any more than they were praising song. This is the characteristic of Hebrew poetry. If you've ever had somebody hear what you were saying and hear something completely different, husbands, you've probably had this happen already today, but if you had them interpret something that you never meant in the first place, this is what's happening in the story. And all Saul can hear is his paranoia, because Hebrew poetry is built all around something called parallelism. Have you heard that before? Say it with me. Parallelism. Okay, parallelism is the key feature of all Hebrew poetry, and if you were going to understand the books of Psalms, Proverbs, or Ecclesiastes, or any of the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, you got to understand what parallelism is, and this is how parallelism works. If you want to impress your friends, just drop that in conversation this week. When somebody says something, you'll be like, yeah, that's parallelism, no big deal. This is what it is. You say something, and then in the second line, you repeat it, but you amplify it a little bit more. This is how almost all the Psalms work. When we're done today, go back and look in the Psalms and you'll see this. You say something, and then the second line you amplify it a little bit more. Or you say something, and the second line you contrast it. Or you say something, in the second line you say it in a different way. You find a different angle. So all Hebrew poetry is built on this. So if I was to say something like this, if I was to say, the sun shines in the morning, brilliantly it lights up the sky and shines down on me, that's parallelism. Because I've said something, and then I've clarified it. You know what? You've all probably heard this before when you were growing up. When your dad said this to you, when your dad said, you are in so much trouble, I brought you into this world and I can take you out of it. Believe it or not, that's actually parallelism. I wouldn't tell him that in the moment. I'd find another time to say it, but that's parallelism because you are saying something and then you are describing it again afterwards. So what's interesting about this song that everyone is singing is this has nothing to do with David versus Saul. See, what the women are actually saying is they are saying that David and Saul together have killed their 10,000s. They are not praising David more than Saul, but Saul can't hear that. Saul can't understand that. All he hears is paranoia, and he is sure that David is out to get the throne, and everybody is rallying behind David when none of that is happening at this point in the story. And so it tells us that Saul kept a jealous eye on David, and it wasn't just his eye he kept trained on David, it was also the point of his spear, because he spends the next 5 chapters trying to kill him. And I think as Jonathan gets caught in the middle of this struggle, there is the throne that is pressuring their friendship. There is this family drama where his dad is trying to kill his best friend. And all the while, they managed to form this incredible friendship. And here is why. Because they were built on 3 critical things that I want you to know this morning. 3 things that you and I can enact and practice in our lives. And what made their friendship last and thrive in the midst of all of these harsh circumstances, first and foremost, was this: loyalty. Jonathan was wildly loyal to his friend David. Even though it was going to cost him the throne, even though it was going to cost him his relationship with his father, Jonathan was wildly loyal to David. And he exemplifies this to a T. He lives it in a way that few of us will ever be called to live in. And you see, true friendship, the truest friendships that you have, they are actually built on this. They are built on the bedrock of loyalty together. Let me say it a different way. They are based on commitment and not on convenience. Real friendships are based on commitment, not on convenience. How do you know a friendship is based on convenience? Because when you stop being together because of work or because of school, the friendship falls away. Have you had that happen before? When you're not in the same area code or zip code, the friendship dissipates. True friendships are based on commitment, not on convenience. And I want you to realize with David and Jonathan's friendship that nothing was convenient about this friendship. Absolutely nothing was convenient. Imagine trying to build a friendship with someone when your dad was trying to kill them every day. How easy would that be? Imagine they come over and your dad pulls out his bow and arrow. Like, that's the response you get when your friend comes over. Every day his dad is hunting for David, and yet they managed to build this through. There was nothing convenient about him. Now, I said friend and not boyfriend. That actually is a dad's job, to sit on the front porch in a rocking chair with a shotgun when the boyfriend comes over. That actually is a part of the job description. But for a friend, imagine trying to build a friendship when your father was trying to kill your friend every single day. There was nothing convenient about their friendship, but it was loyalty that bound them together. A UK newspaper once asked a question of all their readers, and it was super simple. It just says, what is a friend? It was like a wide open blank space question, what is a friend? And they got all sorts of submissions, hundreds and thousands of submissions. And of all of them, they tabulated them up and they voted for them. And do you know what the number one definition of a friend was that got submitted? This is what it was. A friend is somebody who walks in when everybody else walks out. A friend is somebody who walks into your life, into your drama, into your situation. A friend is someone who walks in when everybody else walks out. Do you know what characteristic they identified as the number one characteristic of a friend? Loyalty. Loyalty, commitment. To be there with you not just when life was good or when life was easy, but to be there with you when life got difficult and when the seasons changed. And what makes a friendship last is being built for all seasons, not just summer. It's hard to believe, but 9 years ago, my daughter Audrey was in the hospital. We had just started here as a halftime as I was working in Chatham at the same time. How many remember this story? Audrey was in the hospital for the 14 days after she was born, and they thought there was something wrong with her heart, something deeply wrong. They had her hooked up to all sorts of machines. We couldn't hold her for the first 10 days, and every single day we drove back and forth. Mel was still in the hospital. I drove from Chatham to London, Chatham to London, Chatham to London, every single day for 2 weeks. Our lives had been turned completely upside down, and as soon as this happened, do you know what happened in our lives? As soon as this happened, a whole network of people got together. They put a schedule together, and they cooked food and bought food for us every meal for 14 days. Every meal. Breakfast, lunch, supper was on the table. Someone even took on the job of making sure that things would happen at the right time, and it was convenient for us. And even some of you, friends from church, came to us to our aid in a difficult season in our lives when it wasn't easy, it wasn't summer, it wasn't spring, it was dead winter in the choiring household. And you were there for us, and our friends in Chatham were too. And that is the sign of a true friend, who when the season changes, they don't. When life gets hard, they walk in and they don't walk out. When I had kidney stones, a friend owned the bulk barn in Chatham, and he brought me a gift one time to help me feel better. And a gift was a whole bunch of chocolate stones. I don't know if you've seen this, but in bulk barn, you can actually buy chocolate that looks like stones. And he thought that this would make me feel better. He thought this was funny. I didn't yet. I didn't. It's too soon. You can't laugh about something like that quickly. But we had this whole network, and I look back on my friendships and I realized that there were people that were there for us in our darkest and most difficult moments, and they were the real types of friends, because when life got tough, they walked in, they didn't walk out. When life got tough, they called us. They didn't wait for us to call them. And what I want you to realize is that this bedrock of friendship in the Bible is this. It is loyalty. It is commitment. It is being there for each other, not when just life is good, but when life gets tough. Friendships are based on commitment, not on convenience. I want to encourage you this morning to look for those type of people. Build your life with and around those type of people. Foster those types of relationships. Become that kind of person to the people that you are already close to. One who will be committed, not just convenient. The second thing we learn from their story is that a good friend strengthens your faith in God. A real friend will strengthen your faith in God. I'll just read you a passage about 5 chapters later. I had like 5 chapters I wanted to read to you this morning, and I figured you'd fall asleep by the time I got through them. So we're just going to pull pieces out, but this is from 1 Samuel chapter 23, verses 15 to 18. It says, "While David was at Horesh in the desert of Ziph, he learned that Saul had come out to take his life. And Saul's son Jonathan went to David at Horesh and helped him find strength in God. 'Don't be afraid,' he said. 'My father Saul will not lay a hand on you. You will be king over Israel, and I will be second to you.'" Isn't that amazing? See, Saul is chasing David through, we'll just leave that off. Saul is chasing David through the wilderness. I have been there in Israel. It is the most inhospitable place I have ever seen. It's rock and desert everywhere you can look, and it's called the Strongholds, and he's running for his life, and David is discouraged, and he's almost despondent, and Jonathan risks his life to go and see David, and what does he do? He helps him find strength in God. This is what good friends do for each other. And I want to contrast this just for a little bit for you. Good friends don't just say, "Don't worry, everything's going to be fine." They say, "Don't worry, God's got this, and He will take care of you." Do you see the difference between those two statements? Good friends don't just say, "Don't worry, everything's going to be fine." They say, "Don't worry, God has this, and He will see you through." Good friends don't just send you good vibes. How many of you get sent good vibes all the time? Maybe someone can explain to me what that means, because people tell me all the time who don't believe in God that they are sending me good vibes, and I don't know what that means. But good friends, they don't just send you good vibes. You know what they do? They pray for you. They pound on the door of heaven and say, "My friend is in trouble, Lord. You need to intervene here. You need to change something. You need to step in." A good friend doesn't just tell you, "I'm thinking of you." They say, "I'm praying for you," because a good and a true friend, they help you find strength in God. See, we all have moments where one of the enemy's arrows actually makes its way between the spaces in our armor. We all have moments in our lives where discouragement lands and we get knocked down and we get discouraged and we're not sure that we can get back up again. And a good friend, if you have a good friend in that moment who will help pick you up and encourage you, who will loan you some of their faith when your faith is running low, who will drag you by the neck to church when you don't want to go, those are the kind of friends that will change your life, because they will help you find strength in God. Solomon, he has a cool way of describing this earlier in Proverbs, and he says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one man betters another." Have you heard this before? As iron sharpens iron, so one man betters another. I try to not focus on the fact that God is calling us tools, but as iron sharpens iron, one man betters another. And actually, that's how they used to work their tools back then. They would take one knife and they would sharpen it with another, the way that chefs do these days. They would grind out all the rough edges and they would grind off all the dull corners. And somehow between the two of you would actually make each other better. And this is the kind of friendship that God wants for you and has designed you for, as somebody who will help you become a better person. Somebody who will help you find strength in God. And the third thing that we learn from their friendship is this, is a true friend is someone who speaks the truth. A true friend is someone who speaks the truth even when it hurts. Now, you may not think that you want this. You may hear me say a true friend speaks the truth even when it hurts, and you think, "I don't want that in my life. I just want people who would tell me good things." But I promise you, you really do want these people in your life, and I will explain to you why. Because in our culture right now, everywhere you look in our culture, this is the basic assumption, that if you want to accept me, you have to agree with everything that I do. How many of you have seen this in culture right now? In order for you to accept me, you have to agree with everything that I do. And if you're going to say you accept me, you have to agree with every ridiculous thing I have ever said and every ridiculous thing I have ever done. Otherwise, you don't accept me. You know what, though? There's a huge problem with that. And do you know what it is? It's the fact that you and I do all sorts of things that are ridiculous and wrong. I know that's hard for us to hear in this moment, but the truth is, not everything you have ever done has been right. How many of you have done everything right in your entire life so far? Nice, strong raise of hand. No brave souls. See, the reason why this doesn't work is there are times in every one of our lives where we are going to make a mistake and we are going to choose the wrong path. And the problem with this philosophy is that you will end up cutting off all sorts of people in your life that are actually good for you, even though you didn't enjoy hearing it in the morning. And I know it's crazy to say in our culture right now, I know this is so countercultural to hear, but sometimes you and I are actually wrong. I'm sorry you had to hear that. And we need someone to tell us that. And this is where a good friend comes in, is they are willing to speak the truth to you. The truth, not your truth. That's another phrase that just makes my skin crawl when I hear it. When people say, that's my truth and I'm going to speak it. I don't know what that means because there is only one truth. And real friends, they will tell you that truth even when it's not convenient. And we don't have time this morning, but if you read the story of David after he sins with Bathsheba and he screws up a whole family and a whole lineage, the prophet Nathan comes to David and he tells him this long story about a man who had taken his lamb from his servant who had nothing else, even though he had a whole flock, and he sacrificed it. And David is seething mad afterwards and he says, you tell me who did this and I will fix this. And you know what Nathan says in the end? He says, David, you are that man. See, David was brave, or Nathan was brave, and he brought truth to the king that he needed to hear. And this was a crossroads. This was a turning point in David's life because he had a true friend who was willing to speak the truth to him. When I was on the very first mission trip that I had ever gone on before, it was in Fresno, California, and I've told you a little bit about it before, but we went and we flew all the way down there, and we were working in the projects, so to speak. We were running street ministry and cardboard carnivals, and one of the craziest parts about our whole experience was the fact that our youth pastor lost his voice as soon as he landed. Our fearless leader was mute from the moment we got there. So the rest of us, we somehow had to step up into the void. And there was one day where we were putting on a carnival for like 300 kids. Have you ever put on a carnival out of cardboard boxes for 300 kids? It's a miracle. Absolute miracle. And we were expected to pull off this miracle in the middle of the projects of Fresno, California, one of the roughest cities in all of North America. And I remember that morning when things weren't getting done, we weren't ready, and the kids were almost showing up. I went into drill sergeant mode. Anybody have a drill sergeant mode? Yeah, maybe a couple of honest people. I don't know what happens to me in these moments, but something just clicks and I change and I just start barking orders out in every direction. Like emergencies, they draw this out of me. Maybe hope you've never seen this from me. But all of a sudden, I'm start telling people where to go and what to do. I'm 14 years old at the time. And I'm just telling them what they need to be doing. You go over here and do this. You go over here and do that. Let's get this ready. And for the most part, it worked flawlessly. Like everything was rolling. And we were actually going to make it for this carnival. And then I said something to my friend Andrew. I said, Andrew, you go over there and do this. And he stands there still and he looks at me and says, no, I'm not going to do that. And I said, well, why not? We got to get this carnival ready. We got to get going. And he says, no. And he just stood there. He was much larger than I was actually at the time and older too. And this is not something that I planned and not something that we had intended on happening. But I remember he stood there, and later on that night, there was a bit of a revelation for me. Later on that night, after I tried to figure out why he wouldn't listen, he told me I was bossy. Let's just have a moment of silence for a second here. He told me I was bossy, and I thought to myself afterwards, I'm not bossy, I'm just assertive. By the way, if you ever say something like that, I got bad news for you. Chances are you just might be bossy. So I said, I'm not bossy, I'm just assertive. This was a situation that called for me to step up into a role that I wasn't ready for. I'm not bossy, I'm assertive, but it wouldn't leave me alone. Like the Spirit was kind of tugging on me for the rest of the day. And I remember by the end of the day, we got together and I thought, okay, I'm going to try something here. I got the rest of the team together without Andrew, and I just said, am I bossy? Don't ask questions that you don't want the answer to, by the way. I asked the whole group of my friends together, and I says, am I bossy at this stage of my life? And I remember it was just like out of a movie. Everyone instantly went like this. Like counting stars and looking up and around, and nobody's making eye contact with me. And I'm like, guys, listen to me. Am I bossy? And one or two brave souls kind of looked up to me and said, oh, Chris, we love you, but we love you, and we really appreciate your leadership gifts, but sometimes, yeah, you really are bossy. And I just thought, oh, it's like an arrow to my chest in that moment. Arrow to my chest. Here's the thing, as painful as that moment was, that was a turning point for how I led from that point on. That was the time that my friends were willing to speak the truth to me that actually altered the course of my life and the leadership that I was going to offer, hopefully, for many of you. And it made me think about the way that I interact with people in stressful situations, but the only reason why I learned from that was because my friends were willing to tell me the truth, not just my truth. They were willing to speak the thing that I needed to hear, not just the thing that I wanted to hear. And we are inundated in a culture right now where we only want to hear what we want to hear. The problem is you need to hear hard things sometimes, and a true friend will speak those to you in the right moments at the right time. Over and over again in Proverbs, God says the same thing, that the words of a friend, even though they wound sometimes, are meant for healing. As you look for friends, As you try and transition the friendships that you have and build the ones that you're already engaged with. For some of you, it's not so much. For some of you, you're not in high school, you're not in college, you're not about to reset your whole group of friends. For some of you, it's more so about building on what you have already. But these three characteristics are what makes friendship great. Loyalty, someone who strengthens you in your faith in God, and someone who is willing to speak the truth to you. And I want to encourage you to look for these kind of people, and I want to challenge you to be this type of person. Because the best way to find a good friend is actually to be one yourself. Before we close, I just want to leave you with something that came to me last night as I was reviewing my message, and I was thinking over all of these examples of what makes a true friend, about loyalty, about strengthening your faith in God, about speaking the truth, and something just hit me, and this is all it is that nobody fits this quality of characteristics better than Jesus himself. There is no friend that is better than Jesus. And no matter who you are, and no matter where you are at in life right now, no matter how many other people have walked out that door, Jesus will always walk in, and he is offering you a chance at being his friend. And if you have never made that decision to be the friend of Jesus and to turn your life over to him, we want to invite you today to do that. To make that decision, to make the best friend that you will ever make, the most loyal friend, the one that will strengthen you more than anyone, the one that will teach you and speak to you more truth than you will ever need to hear, to become friends with Jesus, the Son of God, the best friend of all, the friend who sticks closer than a brother. Let's pray. Father, we thank you so much for wiring us for a relationship with one another. And we thank you for giving us insight and instruction in your word about how to seek and build these types of friendships. So, Father, I pray as we go about this week, we would start to think more clearly about these characteristics in our own lives and our own friendships. And that you would start something profound here in this church, that you would start building deeper and stronger friendships within the walls of this church and outside as we continue to follow Jesus together. And like the spokes of a wheel, the closer we get to Jesus, the closer we get to each other. The closer we draw into Jesus, the closer we get to each other with friendships that are true and real, like the one that David held with Jonathan. Jesus, thank you for being our friend, even when no one else will. In your name we pray. Amen.